my name is Jasmine Sky and I'm here today with another video all about stuff from my MFA program. So for those of you who are new, I recently got my MFA in creative writing from the Stone Coast program. I got my MFA specifically specializing in popular fiction, though I don't really think that pertains to this video because this is just 4 general tools that I learned in my MFA program, tools that will make you a stronger writer, a stronger member of the writing community, and things like that. And yes, for those of you who saw my Was My MFA Worth It video, this is my same cohort shirt. I was part of the Stormborn cohort, but this is the V-neck version instead of the crew neck version because I'm bi-gender and I needed 2 versions so that I could express my femininity or masculinity however I wanted. So that's why, I guess. Anyway, I'm gonna link that video down below if you are interested in my thoughts about if my MFA was worth it. Some of the things I talk about in this video, I referenced in that video, but I'm gonna go into more detail in this video and really delve into these 4 tools that I think should be in every writer's toolkit. First and foremost, one of the biggest tools my MFA taught me was how to properly critique. Being a proper critique partner is a really important tool to have when you're in the writer's community. You should hopefully develop relationships with other writers wherein you both critique each other's drafts, and knowing what to put in those critiques and how to do it is just very important. You also might have opportunities to do workshop critique wherein you are in a sort of large group environment and everyone is sort of bouncing off each other to critique someone's story or to have your story critiqued. So knowing proper critiquing is very important, and that is something that MFA programs and undergrad programs too should hopefully teach you, because those are environments in which you will be doing workshop as part of your grade. So I'm just gonna lay out a couple tips and techniques that I learned doing critiquing in the MFA environment and things that my various workshop leaders, professors taught us that are very, very useful that I use to this day when I'm doing one-on-one critiquing with my critique partners. And you know, if I ever do another workshop, which I'm sure I will at some point, things I'll use for that. I can make a whole video about learning to take critique and how you take critique, and maybe I will make that video one day, but this is more about how you can be a proper critique partner and how your critique can help your fellow writer, because learning to really focus on the things that matter in your critique will help your writing be stronger as well. The main number one thing that I learned that one of my mentors, Nancy Holder, taught my workshop group is not to get lost in the details. It's very, very easy when you are critiquing to nitpick and start pointing things out, maybe about the grammar or the spelling, or pointing things out, very small things out about the world building or the general idea. And nitpicking a story is not actually helpful to the writer. Now, if it's at a stage in the process wherein they want you to nitpick, like it's a proofreading pass wherein they want you to point out those little things, yes, absolutely nitpick. But the vast majority of the time, people are turning to their critique partners for those larger developmental edits, those big picture things. And when you get lost in the woodwork, that ends up making the writer feel like you didn't enjoy their story. They're gonna feel like they need to be defensive about those little things, and it does not matter because those little things inevitably will change throughout the larger developmental revisions. So what you need to focus on are those big picture ideas instead of the small things. It's very easy to accidentally get lost in nitpicking, so that's why you should always take a step back and be like, what am I focusing on here? What does the writer that I'm critiquing for want me to focus on? That's something that you should ask. If they don't say it up front, you should ask someone when they ask for your critique, what are the things you care most about with this draft? Are you looking for character arc? Are you looking for larger world building picture? Are you looking for plot structure? What is it that you really want me to focus on? And whatever it is they say, try to ignore the little details. It might be something that really annoys you, but it doesn't matter. You need to focus on what it is that they want to focus on at this point in the draft, because every story goes through multiple drafts, and if it's not a polished proofreading draft, then nitpicking is just not helpful. So before I get lost in the details of that point, we're just gonna move on to point 2 and table, talking about more stuff in regards to being a good critiquer for a later video. So point number 2, or tip number 2 that I learned during my MFA program, and I talked a little bit about this in my previous videos, but again, I want to reiterate, this is a very useful tool that I think you should be doing, and that is to refill your well critically. So when you're in between drafts, or sometimes even when you're drafting a story, depending on your specific process, it's really important to be reading in the genre that you are writing in. And it's even more important to pick out books that you think do something that you want to do, or maybe don't do something that you want to do. So this is part of the structure of my MFA program, was hammering this technique home with the way that we did our academic writing versus our creative writing, and I thought it was so useful. So for instance, when I was working a little bit on an Arthur retelling that I was trying to figure out, for my academic writing, I did things like read original Arthur myths, so think about the larger sort of plot and history of Arthur's stories, but then I also did things like read stories where I was specifically looking at the magic system and the way the magic system informed the story, because I was still trying to figure out my magic system in that world, where I read things that I thought had main characters that had a similar vibe to the type of main character that I was building. Things like that are how you can refill your well and gain inspiration and gain a deeper understanding of the genre and what already exists in the genre. And you can refill your well outside of the genre as well. So like if you're writing, let's say, a YA magical murder mystery, maybe you'll read some YA fantasy to think about the world building and the magic, but then you might also read some adult murder mysteries or middle grade murder mysteries to kind of get a sense of murder mystery techniques and tropes across the wide spectrum of age genre, to then figure out what you think would fit best in your YA murder mystery world, right? So these are the things that you can do to refill your well that is fun and very, very informative and very useful for you pushing your next draft to that next level. So now we're going to transition into some more very specific tools that I learned in my MFA that I think are super useful and aren't talked about very much, that you should definitely consider adding to your toolkit. So number 3, we're going to talk about the redacted exercise. The redacted exercise is something that was taught to me in workshop with Robert Levy, who had learned it from one of his previous workshop professors at his previous institution, I believe is what he said. So I don't know who originally came up with this, but I think it's used across a lot of different MFA programs and master's programs, but it's so useful, and I think it's something that you should consider using just for yourself. The way the redacted exercise works is that you print out 3 copies of your manuscript, and I'm sure there's slight variations to this exercise. You might have heard it before slightly differently, but this is the way that I've been using it, that I was taught. So you print out 3 copies of your manuscript, and if you're writing a whole book, then you don't need to print out 3 copies of your whole book, but I think this exercise is especially useful for like the first chapter or even the first 5 pages. If you're querying your manuscript, you really want to make sure those first pages are super, super strong. So this exercise will really help you critically examine those first pages of your manuscript. So in this case, I went ahead and printed out the first 2 pages of the novel I'm currently working on with my agent, just to show you how it works, and also for me to see how this exercise laid out with my first couple pages, which was very interesting. So you take your 3 copies and you take a black Sharpie, or any color Sharpie really, but black is kind of like the vibe that you're going for with a redaction exercise, and you start crossing out on each different copy one of these 3 categories. You cross out for world building, you cross out action, and you cross out character. Now, I started with world building for this exercise. World building are all mentions of setting, all mentions of sort of background politics, mentions of the magic system, if there's magic in your story, anything like that is world building. And by crossing out all mentions of world building, this helps you see, for instance, if there's way too much crossed out, you're probably info dumping in your first pages. Or if there's not enough crossed out, maybe you have white room syndrome and you haven't described the setting enough. So the goal of this exercise is to get your first pages to a point in which there's a very even spread of redaction so that you know that you have a really good balance in your first pages. So this is my first 2 pages crossed out for world building. I think this is a pretty decent amount of world building. My first drafts definitely had too much in the first couple pages because I was trying to explain the magic system too much, and you really want to push the explanation of the world and spread it out throughout the first couple chapters and even throughout the entire book. So this is where I got to with this draft of my manuscript, and I think it's pretty good. Next, you can cross out for action. Now, action includes all verbs. Every single verb in your story should be action. And this is a way also to help you figure out where your passive voice is, because you'll be focusing so much on those verbs and you want to see all those very strong, direct action verbs. And that's a way for you to kind of polish up your writing a little bit more. And again, also just to see the basic sort of breakdown of these 3 categories. So for my first 2 pages of my manuscript, these are all of my action sentences and the verbs that I have crossed out. So it helps you see how much description you might have in your story. Maybe your language is a little bit too flowery and there's not enough sort of direct verbs and direct action taking place. I think for me, with the way I write, I try to do longer sentences than some other people's writing styles. So this amount of verbiage crossed out is pretty typical for my writing and I enjoy it. But if you're someone who has a little bit more direct writing, you might have a lot more crossed out action verbs, which is fine, but maybe this helps you see places where you want to kind of expand out your sentences a little bit. And finally, the third copy, you're going to cross out for character. One very important note about character and characterization that I was taught is all dialogue is characterization. So any piece of dialogue that is in between quotes within your story, you are crossing that out because that is part of the characterization, which really makes you think your dialogue should inform your characterization. And if it's not, well, we're going to talk a little bit about that in my 4th tool. But yes, all dialogue is character, and also things like character description. So this, for me, was my first 2 pages. Specifically, I noticed when I did this, I'm pretty light on characterization in my first 2 pages, and that's because I have no direct dialogue. I have some indirect dialogue, but in terms of things that are in between quotation marks, I don't have any of that in the first 2 pages. My first dialogue doesn't come until page 3. Now, that is part of because of the style of what this first chapter of this manuscript is written in, but it is something that maybe later I might have to reconsider and try to add more dialogue into my first 2 pages. I do have a different manuscript that I did this exercise with that was very, very different. It was more of a contemporary story, and I realized that my first page of that manuscript was literally all blacked out because it was entirely dialogue for the first half of the page, and then I started getting into some description of what was going on and some action verbs. What this exercise showed me for that manuscript was that I was very much sitting in white room syndrome because I just started the first chapter of that manuscript completely in dialogue and there was no grounding so the readers could really understand where we were and what was going on. So that was something that helped me realize something I needed to fix about that manuscript. In this case, again, I'm pretty light on characterization. Now, again, it's not a bad thing to be light in terms of character description. My physical description of my main character doesn't come for a little bit later, which I think is good because it's pretty stereotypical to be describing your main character's appearance in the first page, and it's not very interesting. So those kinds of things can wait. And the things that I do have crossed out here, I think are fine. I think this is actually a really good spread in terms of characterization outside of dialogue. But the fact that I'm lacking in dialogue in these first 2 pages is something I I might need to consider revising. We'll see. That being said, this is a pretty good look for my story. The amount that is crossed out for each of these categories is a little light on the character, but not so light that it's an immediate problem. It's just something I might need to reconsider. There's not too much world building, so I know I'm not info dumping, and there's not too little world building, so I know it's not White Room Syndrome like that other manuscript I talked about. And the action is sitting pretty good as well. So that was a really useful exercise that I learned, that I use to this day, and hopefully that helps you, especially when you're looking at your first few pages or your first chapter and really trying to make them stronger so that you can get an agent and things like that. And now let's move on to my final tip, tip number 4, which is the dialogue play exercise. I don't really have a direct name for this. The workshop in which I learned it was called Dialogue Intensive, but that doesn't really describe exactly what we do with this exercise. So this was a workshop that I took, one of the most useful workshops I took in my MFA that I absolutely adored and made my dialogue so much stronger, like levels above where it was just from this one workshop. And the way this workshop worked is that I had to turn the first couple chapters of my book manuscript into a screenplay. And the transition of a novel and prose into screenplay highlights your dialogue, because all of those descriptions, all of that world building needs to come in just short little paragraphs that are stage directions and set directions, basically. So short little descriptions about what the set looks like and where it is that you're filming and things like that. But all of those sort of internal explanations about the magic system and things like that go away when you turn it into a screenplay or a script. And this makes it really interesting to see as a writer. Now, it doesn't mean you need to cut those things because you are writing it as a book, but it does show you places in which you can make your dialogue better inform the world without, of course, info dumping through exposition, which is its whole thing. But your dialogue should help inform things for the reader, and definitely, your dialogue should be distinct for each character. So, like I said, I turned the first couple chapters of my book into a screenplay, and then what happened is that my workshop leader invited some actors, specifically some actors for the stage, but that didn't really matter. We got some actors from a local theater group to come and sit, and they took, everyone's manuscripts that they had submitted for this workshop, and they were given roles, and they acted out the script that we had turned in. And that was the most useful thing that I ever had happen in any workshop. Like, I'm still blown away by how much I learned about dialogue just from hearing these actors act out these characters they really didn't know very much about. Once we did the first sort of reading of our script, we then were able to go back and revise our scripts and try to make that dialogue stronger, and then came back and had the actors act it again. And that transition and that way that I struggled and scrambled to turn my dialogue into these more distinct character moments that really sounded like the characters that I had in my head was amazing. And I highly recommend that you try this out. If you have a group of friends, a workshop group, critique group, they don't have to be professional actors, though of course if you have friends who have some experience in theater or in film acting or anything like that, that would be really helpful. But anyone could read for you, and just turn your first chapter into a script and have them read it out as if they were in a reading room for a film or a play or anything like that, and listen to the dialogue and really take a step back. And what you'll probably notice is that some people, some of the actors, will end up interpreting certain characters completely differently from how you had intended them to be, because the way their dialogue is written isn't best informed by the character. And that's a super useful thing to learn. That was the case with my story. One of my characters, the actor made him so angry. And I was like, he wasn't supposed to be angry. He was supposed to be resigned and worried. And then I went back and I looked at the dialogue and I realized what it is that the actor had picked out of the dialogue that was informing that reaction. And that helped me completely revise that dialogue. And now, when I just start a first draft, I have that experience in the back of my head and I'm better at making my dialogue more specific to characters from the get-go. Of course, I still have to revise it and be critical about it, but it's just a really great exercise. Even if you only ever do it the once, it's just very, very useful for you to start to ingrain those ideas about how to make dialogue more specific to your characters. So that's number 4. That was the play dialogue exercise, the script exercise. So that was it. Those were my 4 most useful tools that I learned during my MFA. Again, I think with any of these, I could make a whole video talking about them, but here at least you guys got a brief overview of them and you can start thinking about whether you're going to use them to improve your own writing. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm very interested to hear if any of you have any experience with any of these tools. As always, you can check out my description. I'll link my Was My MFA Worth It video that I mentioned, but I also, as always, have links to various causes that you should support, that you need to support, that we all need to support, so please check out those links in my description. Please, if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, all of that, and I look forward to chatting with y'all in the comments.